CSS Flex is a very powerful and popular concept that allows you to create sort of flexible containers such that you could distribute elements in those containers in different ways. It gives you so much control over the elements in such containers. And also this concept allows you to create responsive layouts easily without using so much media queries. This concept can be confusing to understand. It took me a while to get a good grasp of how CSS Flex works, but I'm going to be making this concept super simple for you in this video, and I have some examples here which I'm going to be using. And the first thing to understand is that Flex is a layout mode. I've been calling it a concept, but a better term is a layout mode. And if you go to the MDN docs, a layout mode is an algorithm that determines the position and size of boxes based on the way they interact with their sibling and ancestor boxes. The default layout mode is the normal flow, and here you have your block and you have your inline. So if I come back to this example here, let me quickly take you through the code. It's a simple one. I have a div with a class of container, and then I have like 5 of these boxes. Each of them contains some lorem ipsum stuff. And then for the style, this is the container here, minimum height, border radius, and this is the box here. The box has a border and a background, and I control the border and background using this theme custom property of each boxes so that each of the boxes are identical. Now by default, this container, which is a div, has a display of block. And with display of block, this is the normal flow. All the items that you put in your HTML is just going to flow naturally one after the other. You also have the table flow, float flow, position flow, all these other ones. But here we have the flexible box layout, which is Flex. So now by coming here and changing this from display block to display flex, now we get a new order of our boxes, and the height and the width is calculated based on the flex algorithm. And there's also CSS grid, which is also super powerful, but I'm going to be making a separate simplified video on that. So a good way to approach CSS Flex is to think in Flex. I don't know if that makes sense, but the idea here is that the Flex algorithm or the Flex layout comes with a new mental model than what you would usually have with display block or display inline. And before we move further to work on these examples, let's look at this quick drawing. So when you have an element with a display of Flex, that element is now going to have the Flex layout, and in this case that element is this green here. Now all of these boxes in this element are going to be called Flex children. Now we have this container like this. A very important concept to understand in Flex is the main axis and the cross axis. The main axis by default is row from left to right horizontally, and the cross axis is vertical from top to bottom. It's very important to understand this because many of the things you do with Flex are going to be focused on the main axis, and then you have few configurations for the cross axis. So when you have your display of Flex, by default the Flex direction is row, and in row you have your main axis left to right and you have your cross axis top to bottom. But you can also change your Flex direction to column, and when you do this, your cross axis becomes the left to right and your main axis is top to bottom. You also have row reverse, which means your main axis is going to be horizontal but from right to left, and you also have column reverse, which means your main axis is going to be vertical but from bottom to top. It's very important to know this because you have different properties that you can use in Flex containers, and these different properties would often be controlling something in the main axis or in the cross axis. Okay, now that we have this out of the way, let's come back to our code, and I'm just going to remove the last two boxes for now. So when you have your display of Flex, on your main axis by default you have just one row, and what the Flex container will try to do is that it will try to put all your children elements on that one row. Now in this case, all our elements can stay on one row without any problems. When the screen becomes super small, you see the Flex container is still trying to put everything on one row. It gets to this point where it cannot put everything on one row again because the content cannot get smaller, so it is coming out. Now in this case, this is where you use Flex wrap. So here you have your Flex wrap, and the default value is no wrap. But when you say wrap, then this is what the Flex container does. When it gets to that point where it cannot put those items on one line, instead of squeezing things until it cannot squeeze any longer, it just goes to the next line. So in this case, we now have 3 rows. If we do it like this, we have 2 rows because these 2 elements can fit on one row and this one on the other row. And if you expand this enough, you have just 1 row with all items in it. Now, as we progress in this video, I would come back back to the Flex wrap. I just wanted to show you that for now. So like I mentioned earlier, Flex allows you to control the distribution of your elements. And one property you can use to control how your elements are distributed is justify content. The justify content allows you to distribute your elements on the main axis. And before I use justify content, let me remove the padding on this container so that you can see how the things are actually distributed. So the default value of justify content is Flex start. And so the contents, this group of elements on the main axis, is going to start from the start of the Flex container. You also have Flex end, and now this whole group is going to be positioned at the end of the Flex container on the right. You also have center, the group would be at the center. You have space between. This is going to spread that group in such a way that you have this one at the start, you have this one at the end, and then you have some spaces between each of the Flex children. You also have space around. In this case, you have a bit of space at the Flex start and the Flex end, and some spaces in between the elements. You also have space evenly, and in this case, each of the elements are going to have even space. So the same space you have here, you have it here, you have it here, and you have it here. So justify content is for distribution on the main axis. Remember, the main axis is from left to right horizontally. Let's take this back to Flex start. Another property that you have for controlling how your Flex children are distributed is align items. In the case of align items, the default value is stretch. Align items controls the distribution of your Flex children on the cross axis, which is the vertical from top to bottom. And the default value is stretch. That is why these children elements, their height stretches to the height of the container. If I should make the height of the container 400 pixels, you see again that it stretches to that 400 pixels. Let's take this back to 700. So here we have values like Flex start. All the items are going to be positioned from the start of the cross axis. So the start, and the start. If you have Flex end, all the items are going to be positioned at the end of the cross axis. Remember again, cross axis. Now let's say we had a Flex direction of column. Things would look a bit different. The same concept of Flex still applies. Justify content is for main axis, align items is for cross axis. Now with the Flex direction of column, the main axis is now vertical, top to bottom. Remember our diagram here. And the cross axis is horizontal, left to right. So when we have align items of Flex end, you can see that all the items now go to the end of the cross axis. Personally, I use Flex direction column in very specific cases. Else, I stay with row because it is an easier way to understand how Flex containers work. Another value you have for align items is center. This positions each of the Flex children at the center of the cross axis. Remember again, the cross axis is vertical, top to bottom. And the other values you can use with align items for specific cases, but for most cases you'll be using either Flex start, Flex end, center, or as we saw, which is the default, stretch, where all the items now stretch on that cross axis. Now you're probably wondering, why do we have justify content, but here we are using align items? Why are we not using align content? I'm going to have a separate video where I go into more detail on justify content, align items, and align content, so don't worry about that. But later on, we're going to see how align content works. Align content is easier to understand when we have multiple rows. Here we have just one row, so that's why we're using just align items. But a good way to understand this is when you say items, you are treating each item individually. Remember when we have justify content and then we had center, this takes the whole group, which is the whole content, to the center. So when you say align items, you are treating each item. You are saying all items stretch. When you say center, it doesn't take the group to the center. Instead, it takes each item to the center. And probably later when we look at align content, you would see how things are different. But then align items and align content is for cross axis. Justify content is for main axis. You also have a property called align self. In each Flex children, you can use an align self. And what this does is that it allows you to control the specific element that you want. So in this case, our align items is center. So you can think of this as the Flex container container is setting the align self of every children to center. But you can say for my first child, I want the aligned self to be stretch. Again, on the cross axis. You see the first item now stretches. Or you can say I want this to just be at the start, or I want this to just be at the end. You can do whatever you want with align self. Now you're probably thinking maybe we also have justify self. Well, we don't have justify self. So even if I put this at center, nothing happens. I'm going to explain this more in the detailed video. So let's just comment this align self. And the next thing we want to look at is growing and shrinking elements. And this is where the power of Flex becomes even more obvious. So when you have your Flex container, what this does for every Flex children, which in this case is box, is that it sets a Flex grow of 0, a Flex shrink of 1, and a Flex basis of auto. Now, what do these properties even mean? Let's go back here and let's put our align items as stretch, and let's put our justify content as Flex start. Now, these properties are very useful because they allow you to avoid other ways that you may want to control the size of your elements that can be tedious. For example, let's say you want all these elements to fill the container. To achieve this, you might say I want the first child to have a width of 40%. I want the second child to have a width of 30%, and I want the third child to have a width of 30%, which makes it 100% in total. And now this fills the container. Now this is one way that you can achieve this and you get that bit of responsiveness, well, unless the content is going out of the container. But when it comes to Flex containers, you have Flex, grow, shrink, and basis, which is a more controlled way of managing the sizes of your Flex children. But let's come back to this. So like I said, by default, all your children is going to have Flex grow 0, Flex shrink 1, Flex basis of auto. But now we can come to this first child and we can tell the Flex container that I want this to grow by 1. And what this means is that you can see this space that is available here. The Flex container is going to add this space to the first child. So the first child gets bigger, the first child grows. So if I do this, you can see that the first child is down bigger. There was some extra space, so that space was added to the element. But we can also come to this second child and say that we want it to also grow, and the third child we want it to also grow. And if you do this, you now see that that extra space that we had is going to be distributed accordingly for the 3 Flex children. If you're wondering why I'm using 1, 1, 1, you can use any value that you want. The only thing to note here is that when you say 1, 1, 1, altogether you have 3. So what you're saying is this one should have 1 over 3. This second child should also have 1 over 3 of the available space, and this one should also have 1 over 3 of the available space. Even if you use 10, 10, and 10, it's still going to mean 10 over 30, 10 over 30, 10 over 30. So you can use any values here. The Flex container would do its calculation. So here we are saying Flex grow of 1 for each of them. But what if you want your second child to be wider than your first and third child? Then here you can use a Flex grow of 2, which means this second child is going to get 2 times of the available space compared to the first and third child. So in this case, this is going to be 1 over 4. This is going to take 2 over 4 of that available space, and this is going to take 1 over 4 of that available space. And if I come here now and refresh it, maybe you don't notice the difference, but if I zoom out a bit, you can see now that the second child is bigger than the first and the third child. That is because this second child takes 2 units of the space available. So a good way to look at this is units. This takes 1 unit, this takes 2 units, this takes 1 unit of the available space. But before we look at Flex shrink, let's look at Flex basis. Now in this case, Flex basis is auto. Think of it as the minimum width of your Flex children. Now I'm using width, but Flex basis can also be for height. How do you know what Flex basis or Flex grow or Flex shrink is for? Well, when your Flex direction is row, Flex grow, Flex shrink, Flex basis, they are all going to apply to the width of your Flex children. But when your Flex direction is column, all of these are going to apply to the height. But let's keep this back as row so we know this is applying to the width. Now it means here that the minimum width of all our elements is going to be based on the content. But here we can use a Flex basis of 300 pixels, for example. You see now that this first item and this third item have the same size. That's because the base width is no longer automatic based on the content, but we now have a fixed base width. But this is not really a minimum width. And the reason why I say this is, now coming back here, because we have a Flex shrink of 1, let me come here and change the flex grow back to 1 so that everything is the same. Now when we have a flex shrink of 1, we're telling the flex container in this case that I want all my flex children to have a flex basis of 300 pixels, but if the container cannot contain 900 pixels, which is 300 pixels, 300 pixels, 300 pixels, then I want you to shrink those children. So in that case, since all the children have a flex shrink of 1, they are all equally going to be shrinked. Let me take all my flex grow of 1 so that you can see the flex basis. Here we have the flex basis, which is 300 pixels. Let's make this more obvious with 400 pixels. And because we have a flex shrink of 1, this is what happens. The flex container can put 400 pixels on the same row, but once it lacks space, you can see each of the children are now shrinking. But if we put flex shrink 0, we're telling the flex container, under no circumstances, do not shrink. I want this to stay at 400 pixels minimum. And now if I should refresh, of course, we're now going to have an overflow. Let me make the flex overflow obvious by putting this padding of 20 pixels back. So here we have an overflow because the flex container is like, hey, you wanted a flex basis of 400 pixels, but I can't put everything on one row. So now we have that overflow. But of course, when we have enough space, we don't get that overflow. Everything can go in. So this is the role that flex shrink plays. But instead of having this overflow, if you remember from earlier, what we can do is we can turn on flex wrap. So when we do this, the flex container is going to say, hey, I can't put 300 pixels on the same line. So I'm going to go to the next line. So I have 2 rows. So here we have 1 row, but then we get to this point where we now have 2 rows. We're still going to turn this off for now. So with flex shrink, you can also say that I want the first child to shrink faster than the other children. So again, using these units. So here we have flex shrink of 1. We also have flex shrink of 1 here, but this one has flex shrink of 2, which means it's going to lose space more than these other items here. And if I should refresh, you see that the first item gets smaller faster than the other items. So depending on what you're trying to achieve, you can play around with these values. Again, if we come back here and we put a flex grow of 1 and the other children contain flex grow of 0, you see that the first child is taking the extra space that is available. So I hope these 3 properties now make more sense to you. If they don't worry, I have a more detailed video where I break down how these 3 properties work. I'll link them in the video description. I'm going to comment this. The next property I want us to look at is called gap. So with gap, you can have gap 20 pixels. This is going to apply a gap between the children on the main axis and the cross axis. So here we now have this gap. You might be thinking, why are you using gap? Why aren't you using maybe a margin right or margin left on each of the children? Well, if you are using a margin right, let's say we use a margin right of 30 pixels, and let's say we have a flex grow of 1 on the box. Let me come to this container and remove this padding. Now what you notice here is we have a margin right after this element, we have a margin right after this element, and we have a margin right after this element. But of course you can see things don't really look nice because what is this extra space? If you try margin left, well, now you get a space here because each item has that margin left. So using margins, you might get those odd spaces at the edges unless you want to do the extra work of saying, okay, for the first child, don't give it a margin left, but give a margin left to the others. That's just going to make things more tedious. But when you come and you use gap 20 pixels, gap is going to apply the gaps between those children without touching the edges. So here I can use my gap of 40 pixels, and here we now have the gap between these children. Now let's come back and put our 2 items here. Now by putting this, of course, we now get that overflow. I like putting this padding so that you can see the overflow more obviously. Like I said earlier, this is because the flex container tries to put everything on one main axis. Here our main axis is the row, so it tries to put everything on one row. But now when we come and put flex wrap, now the flex container will say, okay, I can't put everything on one row again based on the different things we have configured for flex grow, flex shrink, flex basis. So then it goes to the second row. And yeah, you see how these 2 items automatically fill that space at the bottom. This is because each of the items has a flex grow of 1. If I put this back at 0, it's going to wrap to the next row, but they don't fill that extra space. But if I take this back to 1, this space here is going to be divided between these 3 children. This space here is going to be divided between these 2 children. So you can see how just by using few properties here, we are not using any media queries to say 100%, 50%, 30%. The flex layout is calculating all of this for us. If we increase the size of the screen now we have 4 items on the first row. Now we have 5 items on the first row. If we reduce it, the flex item just knows how to calculate stuff. You can already imagine something like this as maybe this is your footer, this is something, 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 something. And if you go even smaller, everything then comes to one column. So now that we have this, if I take my flex grow back to 0, come back here to my justify content and I say center, this is going to apply justify content center on the first row as a group and also on the second row as a group. If you also have flex end, same concept applies. Remember, justify content is for the main axis, and since we're on the row direction, the main axis is horizontal, and we can also use space between. But now align items might not work the way you expect it to work now that we have 2 rows. When we had 1 row previously, you saw how it worked. It allows you to control each items on that cross axis. But now let's here have an align items of flex start. Look at what happens. This is weird. And the reason for this is now we have 2 rows. So when you say justify content, it's going to apply that justify content on the first row and on the second row. And when you have align items, this is going to align your items on the cross axis of those 2 main axes. So for this main axis, the align items is going to align each of the items on the cross axis of this main axis. And then for this second main axis, align items is going to align the items on the cross axis of that main axis. So a good way to look at this is when you have your flex wrap and you have 2 rows or 3 rows or multiple rows, you can think of each of those rows as a sub flex container. So each of those rows have their main axis and cross axis. So even if this is like 3 rows, here you have 3 main axes. In the first main axis, you have your cross axis. In the second main axis, you have your cross axis. In the third main axis, you have your cross axis. So if we even use align items of center, you see again that it's going to align to the center of the cross axis of each of the main axis. So how do we tell the flex container now that I want to align the rows in the whole flex container? This is where we use align content. So if you have align content and we now have center, let me comment the align items for now. You now see that the flex container can then take everything as a group and position it as on the center. Remember again, if you have align items of center, it's going to treat each of the children on the center of the cross axis of that main axis. And here we have 2 main axes. But with align content of center, the flex container is going to treat everything here as a box, and then it's going to take each of the rows that we have and align them on the cross axis. Again, you see why I mentioned earlier that with content, you're thinking of everything as a group, but with items, you are thinking of each item in their own main axis. So here with align content, you can also have flex start. This would move everything as a group to the start. If we had align items of flex start, it doesn't move everything as a group. It only moves each items in their own main and cross axis. You can also have flex end here as a group. You can also have space between here. It's going to take it as a group and apply the space between them. You can also have space evenly. Then you have this. You can also have space around, and you have this. So one interesting thing you can do here is that you can have center, which moves everything as a group to the center. Remember that align items by default has a value of stretch, and that is why the items are stretching in their cross axis. So if you should have this at flex start, even though the whole group is at the center, each of the items are going to be at the start of each of the main axes. So let's just keep this at stretch. So now if we should have justify content center, and we have align item stretch, which is the default, so we can remove it anyways, and we have align content center. Now you have everything positioned at the center of the main axis and at the center of the cross axis. Again, I'll make a separate video where I go into more detail on align content, align items, and this, but I hope this is clear enough. And one great way you can use a concept like this is, let's say we had only one box in our parent container. You see that box is exactly at the center because we have justify content center, align content center. In this case, align items of center would also work since we have just one row. So you see, I refresh, nothing changes. So it is still going to position it at the center of the cross axis of that one main axis. So an easy way to position things at the center, and this is just a bonus tip of this video, is to have display flex, justify content center, align items center. So even if we resize this, it stays at the center. I just did this and look at how things look look like now, because I have the align items of center. So if I keep this at stretch and I put my align content center, now everything comes to the center. I hope this video gives you a better understanding of Flex. If you remember, I said earlier that when working with Flex containers, you have to think in Flex, because once you put this display Flex here, you automatically turn on a couple of features of CSS. Features like your Flex Grow, Flex Shrink, Flex Basis, Flex Direction, Flex Wrap, Justify Content. You automatically turn on these things, which you can use to distribute the children in that Flex container in different ways. And if you remember earlier, I said this allows you to achieve responsive layout without media queries. As this is already super responsive. If I should come here and add a Flex Grow of 1, everything is going to grow accordingly. It's at the center of the column. I can come and I can say that the first child should grow twice as fast than the other children, and this grows more. I can even say grow 10 times faster than the other children, and it grows more, and all of this stays responsive even when you resize the screen. I can even come to this align content and say stretch, so that it stretches the whole group, and look, everything fills the screen. Same thing applies, same thing applies, same thing applies. Again, I hope that this video helps you understand Flex better. I'm also currently working on a playlist currently on my channel where I cover different properties related to CSS Flex. So on there, I'm covering properties like this Flex Grow, Flex Shrink, and Flex Basis, also properties like order, also properties like this align content, align items, justify content, and a lot more properties that you can use in Flex containers. So definitely check out that playlist. I would link it in the video description. You should also see it somewhere on the screen. And I hope that this set of videos helps you become a professional at using CSS Flex. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a like, share with others, and subscribe for more videos like this.